Hi guys, a couple of months ago I shot a video about winged spears. Okay, this being an example. This is the Hanway example, but you can get ones made by cold steel, called in their case a boar spear. And I talked about the fact that there is a certain type of winged spear like this, which is from the sort of early Middle Ages. You see them appear in the, say, 7th, 8th century, and they're used right the way through to the 14th, 15th century. However, there are other types of winged spear which I made reference to. There are boar spears, which are really a specialised hunting weapon, but you do sometimes see them in a fighting context, in a military context. Boar spears differ from this quite a lot. Okay, a boar spear has a shorter head. No need for, this is a long cutting blade like a partisan, which I'll talk about partisans in a minute. But a boar spear has a short point because it's just for penetrating essentially the boar, and usually much broader. Okay, so a boar spear is kind of like more of a traditional leaf-shaped spearhead, broader, shorter, and the crossbar is usually much closer to the point. Okay, so some people have given the opinion that these wings on this type of winged spear are to prevent over penetration or getting your weapon stuck in the opponent. Now, I'm not going to say that that's wrong, but I think that it's highly unlikely. Why? Because look at how much blade you've got in front of these wings. You've got at least 18 inches of blade in front of these wings, and in fact some historical examples have got an easy 2 foot of blade in front of the wings here. Okay, so if you were to thrust this into a person, into a human's body, say 18 inches or 24 inches deep, you at that point have already over-penetrated. Okay, you've got a huge amount of blade sticking out of the back of their body, and you're going to have a lot of problem if you've gone through their torso. You're going to have a lot of problems extracting that weapon, and quite literally probably what you'll end up having to do is place your foot against their body and pull it out like you would, you know, if you were got an axe stuck in a log or something like that. You're going to have to wiggle it, you're going to have to put your foot against it, and you're going to have to do lots of pulling and probably a little bit of twisting as well to get it back out again. There are many records of spears and bayonets getting stuck in human bodies. And in actual fact, in the 19th century, there are records of socket bayonets, which are a triangular spike with a sort of right angle junction at the bottom, which then you have a tube and that slides onto the musket. Actually, sometimes over penetration with a socket bayonet could lead to that junction, that kind of right angle junction at the bottom of the bayonet, entering the body as well, and the musket point entering the person's body. People are quite squishy, and yes, you can quote me on that. When you're poking something long and pointy into them, they tends to go in fairly easily. I talk about how difficult it is to cut, but thrusts, conversely, it's very easy to thrust something sharp into someone's body. And one of the problems in warfare is over-penetration, the weapon going too far into the person's body, and therefore either you cannot get your weapon out at all, or sometimes you just cannot get it out in time. In other words, someone else attacks you and the person couldn't extract their weapon quick enough to defend themselves, or in the situation of cavalry, there are instances from history where a lance or a sword penetrated an opponent's body and the horses passed each other, and essentially they lose their weapon because it's stuck in a person's body, and a dead person who's riding off on a living horse, and their weapon's going with them. So I do not think that this type of winged spear, this was specifically to prevent over-penetration, because if you penetrate to this point, you have already over-penetrated. You only really want to penetrate with a thrust for about 6 inches at most, okay? Because most people's bodies are, if you're in good shape, are only about 6 or 8 inches deep. You don't, once this sticks out of their back, there's no point going in further because you've already made the biggest hole that you're going to make, unless you start wiggling the thing, okay? But that's got nothing to do with depth, that's to do with width. So, what I do think these, as I said in the previous video, were primarily probably for, were partly defensive, because as we know from later treatises, these are sometimes used for parrying or pushing aside an opponent's pole. If we've got weapons opposing each other and your weapon comes in towards me, it's quite convenient to be able to push your pole aside with this crossbar. And equally, rather than over penetration as such, if I do penetrate to that point, what it enables me to do is then push the person, keep the person far away from me. So it does, to an extent, prevent the person coming up the shaft. And there is a 19th century source, which I'll quote in a future video, I'm sure, where an opponent ran the other guy through with a bayonet, and literally the opponent came up the muzzle of up the barrel of the musket, and then chopped the guy's head off. Okay, in his last death throes. So I think those are the main reasons for the lugs. Therefore, perhaps pinning something far away from you. And they're also for defensive purposes, and potentially also for hooking the edge of shields and hooking the edge of other weapons and such like towards you as well, or even limbs as well, perhaps even behind someone's knee or this kind of stuff. Now, just briefly to mention partisans. Partisans do also have little lugs or ears at the bottom of the blade. So if we imagine this is a partisan for a second, so those wings aren't there, what we have are little projections at the base of the blade here. I do not think that they're really there to prevent over penetration as such, because they're usually quite small. And as I mentioned from the bayonet example I just gave, if you thrust a person's soft and squidgy body with a large bladed implement with these little hooks at the bottom, I think a lot of the time those little hooks are actually going to penetrate into the body as well. So I don't think that they're big enough or blunt enough to really prevent over penetration. What I think they're there for is primarily the same reason as these wings, whatever those reasons should be. So I think it's partly defensive, partly pushing aside an opponent's weapon, these kind of things. Okay? If you look at a boar spear, which is to prevent over penetration, the crossbar, which is there to prevent the over penetration, is quite close to the point. It's usually only about 6 or 8 inches away from the point, which is, as far as I mentioned, as far as you want to thrust into a living creature to kill it. And the crossbar itself is quite long. They're usually as long as a crossguard on a medieval sword. So you kind of imagine a crossguard on a medieval sword connected up here. Okay, so they're very long, very blunt, and quite close, relatively close to the point. And last thing I'll mention on this, there are boar hunting swords as well. There's a good example in the Wallace collection in London, and they have a point on them that essentially looks like a boar spear. They have a flared edged point, and then they have a square hole in the blade through which a crossbar, almost like a second crossguard, goes. Incidentally, it goes in the opposite plane to the crossguard, so if the crossguard goes that way, the bar on the boar hunting sword usually goes the opposite direction, for whatever reason. Yeah, so it goes through to prevent over penetration, and again, it is usually quite close to the point. It's never really more than about 8 or 10 inches at most. Okay, so it's a very different situation to the wings on a medieval winged spear. Different, similar design, but for a different purpose, I think. Thank you.